assessment as a way of finding out whether students have achieved their learning outcomes, and as a way for students to receive feedback to have a sense of how they're travelling. If we are short of integrity within the way that we assess, then assessment doesn't tell us that. It tells us how good students are at getting somebody else to do their work, how good they are at using somebody else's work, and how bad we are at identifying that. And that's neither helpful as a measure of student ability, nor is it useful for students to gain useful feedback on their work in order to further develop their ideas, their skills, their knowledge, their attributes. The different ways of thinking about this. The easiest way is to think at the level of the individual. Why is it that one student might breach academic integrity? And then it's easy to think about it as a problem being of one of bad individuals who've got poor ethics, or at least unsophisticated moral reasoning, and so they're cheating either because they decide to or because they don't know what they're doing is cheating. That's really quite an easy way of thinking about misconduct. In some cases it might be accurate, but it's a pretty awful way of trying to respond to the problems posed by academic misconduct, because it removes the actions of the individual from a much broader environment within which it might occur. And I think it's much more useful to think about academic misconduct in assessment as at the level of the individual, but also at the level of the institution, the level of the sector, and at the level of the ways in which the sector holds institutions accountable for the way in which they act. So, at the level of the institution, academic misconduct might be fostered by cultures and climates that combine to create an environment within which individual selfishness, egoism might prevail. And the probability that teachers and students will conduct themselves ethically might be influenced, for good or for bad, by organizational culture, by systems, by policies, by leadership that exists within their organization. In that way of thinking, we see people taking shortcuts because there may be no other way of playing the game. What does that mean? It means that students cheat because the assessment is so poorly conceived, or because they're so poorly supported, or that academics create inappropriate assessment because they're not able to create better assessment. They don't know how to do it. Or they can't identify or they can't respond to misconduct because they lack the tools or they lack the time to do so. And one of the reasons why that might happen is that we have a mix of policies and practices at the institutional level, but also at the national level. So very few countries in the world have a national strategy around academic integrity and academic misconduct. Australia is perhaps one of the exceptions, because it has a national unit at federal government level that has responsibility for tackling essay mills, for making it illegal for those mills, for organised crime, to try and recruit students as customers for their sites. And really very few countries have gone this way. There's another layer, and that is the equivalent of the fourth arm of government, which is the accountability arm. Do we have accountability and oversight of the way that institutions behave? So when a university has poor practices, poor policies, is there anyone to whom they're accountable for that other than to themselves? And again, in Australia, the answer is yes. We have standards that universities and that the sector has to meet. And we have TEQSA, which is the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, that will review the actions of universities over a period of time. There are considerable concerns at the moment. There are some panics about changes that are occurring in the way in which we assess and the pressures on students in response to those changes. It would be tempting to say that what we're going through now is one of the biggest periods of stress for integrity in assessment, except for all the other ones that we've had in the past. So we have a series of panics about our ability to ensure that the assessment that we're offering is authentic and has integrity. But here are some of the pressures at the moment. There was, in Australia and in many other countries, there was a very rapid switch to online teaching and to online assessments as a result of COVID. Some institutions had been doing this for years. This was not new for them. But for other institutions, these changes were made within sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, as borders went up or down, as students were confined, as campuses closed. That placed real pressure on academics and institutions to create, for them, new forms of assessment and to assure the integrity of that. And it was tempting to say, well, if only we could go back to the good old days when we did face-to-face exams, we would therefore get rid of the problems associated with online assessment. The problem with arguing that is that we know that there are already issues with the face-to-face exams, the traditional face-to-face exams that Australia ran, and that therefore simply seeking to flip back to what we did before COVID doesn't tackle the difficulties that are associated with our tendency to assess based on memorization, based on regurgitation of information, and to do so within a short time limit. Because that's just not authentic assessment, or at least it's rarely going to be authentic assessment. So the first concern is about this shift to online teaching and online assessment. The second shift, or second concern, is about collusion between students. And there's some concern that this was accelerated by COVID because students were distanced from their teachers. They responded sometimes by creating online groups to discuss assessment. And in discussing assessments, they often crossed what some academics saw as the line about what was acceptable discussion about the assessment. Which reveals the problem, which actually the collusion between students is often not because of COVID, but because of a lack of clear expectations by institutions about what is acceptable collaboration, which institutions want, which teachers want, which students want, and unfair collusion, where the resultant assignment is not representative of a particular student's ability or work. So switch to online teaching and assessment for COVID, collusion between students, and the final one is a very big one, and that's the technological threat posed by various corporate moves and organized crime moves into servicing the purported needs of higher education students. So one way of doing this historically has been to commit fraud during exams. That might be by putting by identity fraud, by putting the wrong person into an exam. So somebody takes an exam on behalf of somebody else. That doesn't seem to be a huge issue within Australia, but it has been an issue in English language testing that's been conducted offshore in order to get into Australian universities. Second part of that, and that's something that's been growing over the last few years, has been essay mills, and that's just how easy it is to pay somebody else to write your assessment. That's been happening online. Organised crime has entered into this, and as a result, we're seeing students who have paid for essays to be written by those organisations subsequently being blackmailed by those organisations because they cheated. And it's become even more worrisome very recently as we've seen artificial intelligence reaching the point that it can write grammatically correct answers to questions that are posed. So we know that you can take a question to various artificial intelligence programs that are now available online and get an essay created. At the moment, we also know that that essay, whilst it might look plausible to somebody who doesn't know the area, we've all tests with artificial intelligence have found that they make up stuff, that they're out of date in some cases because the databases were closed off. So it's now 2023. Some of the databases that they're using were closed off in 2021, but also that it's stacking material together in a way that's just incorrect. And it looks very much like it's guessing at answers in some of the responses that we've seen. So that's both clearly cheating, but also undercutting, it's making it really quite hard for academics to sort through the fakery associated with the answers that are coming out of artificial intelligence. As always, there will be a technology race because artificial intelligence measures will be used to counteract the artificial intelligence that's writing the essay. So we'll have ways of detecting artificial intelligence using artificial intelligence. And then we'll slowly see that race continue over time. There are two main ways, and I want to argue that actually both of them are important. The first one is about building students' capacity to engage with assessment with integrity. And that means equipping them with the capabilities and the values necessary to conduct ethical scholarship. The second one is, well, the first one is proactive. The second one is both proactive and reactive. And that's about securing assessment. And it means taking care with assessment design to design out opportunities for cheating. It's tempting to imagine that we can nail down all assessment, but actually it's better to look at a whole of course and think about those assessments that really matter, and then taking measures, best measures that you can to secure those. It's also about finding ways to detect academic misconduct and then having fair ways of acting once you've discovered academic misconduct. We develop our moral thinking over time. Sometimes we follow rules because we're told to follow them. But it's much more effective to follow conventions and ideas around integrity because not only do we understand them, but we actually think that those are values that we want to adopt. So for students to act with integrity around assessments, they would need to understand why we're assessing them, why we're assessing them in the way that we are, what's appropriate, what are appropriate ways for them to behave, and then they've got to think that those ways are worthwhile. So, for example, significant problem perhaps with plagiarism in some courses. In order to tackle that, students need to understand what plagiarism is, that it's lifting other people's work without attribution. They've got to understand the conventions of not doing so, so this is how you attribute. And then they've got to value the idea of taking other people's ideas, synthesizing them, critiquing them, putting them back together into something that represents their own ideas. So that's a much more sophisticated response than simply telling students don't plagiarize. It's about challenging the values that would underpin plagiarism. There are a range of ways in which we can try and design assessment so that it is it makes much less sense to plagiarize. One part of that would be to make the assessment more authentic. Another is to much more clearly link it to individual students' interests and to track how that assessment is developing over time. Let me give an example. So my own discipline area was criminology, and typically we could ask students to write an essay about the biases in the creation of an article about crime in the newspaper. That kind of essay has probably been set in every American criminology course. You can find those essays online. It's not easy to lift something that might not be easy to find even on Google when checking or want to turn it in. But there's some really easy ways of not doing that whilst achieving the same result in the assessment. So I've worked in South Australia and Western Australia. I asked pretty much the same question, but I required students to pick an article written over the last 10 months about either South Australia or Australia, and to write about that, and to use that as their case study in order to work through the theoretical analyses that you can use with those articles. That meant that they couldn't copy from another country. It meant that they couldn't copy from students a year before, because they had to choose something within the last 10 months within Australia. And there isn't such a lot, there is really quite a small academic criminology community, and most assessors would know what's been written in the last year about the media portrayal of crime in Australia. So those were really two quite small tweaks that allowed us to assess exactly the same thing, but in a way that was closer to students because they live in Australia, and was closer to their time, it's about now, and yet excluded many possibilities for cheating.